Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I texted. My brother replied, "We're busy, try Uber." The blue check marks appeared almost instantly, one by one. My message was seen. No typing bubble followed, not even the pretend kind that flickers and disappears. Just stillness. And then the ping. "We're busy. Try Uber." My heart didn't break, not in the dramatic sense. It folded inward like soft paper underwater. I stared out the small oval airplane window, watching the wingtips slice through clouds, a dull ache blooming behind my eyes from 30 sleepless hours and something else I couldn't name. When the plane touched down, I didn't move right away. The other passengers stood, shuffled, reached for overhead bags, and chatted about dinner reservations. I sat still, letting the tide of them pass me by. My seatbelt felt tighter than it should have. My coat clung to me like a damp second skin. I hadn't cried. Not yet. I wasn't sure I could. As I walked through Portland International Airport, the fluorescent lights hit harder than usual. Every sign, every announcement felt too loud. I passed families reuniting with tearful hugs, partners exchanging knowing smiles. A teenage girl jumped into her father's arms, and he laughed so loud it echoed. I kept my eyes on the tile floor. There had been a time when I believed my return would mean something, that they'd be waiting, maybe even with a sign or just open arms. But I was just another passenger now. No one is looking for me. I reached the baggage carousel just as my suitcase rounded the curve, black, scuffed, and overstuffed. I hauled it off the belt, then reached for the 2 others I'd checked. James's things. His favorite sweater, the small carved box from our trip to Bali, and his books. Everything I could carry back from Singapore across oceans and grief. My phone buzzed again. "Why didn't you plan better?" My mother, blunt as ever. I didn't reply. What would I say? The cart's wheel caught on a crack in the tile. It jolted, and before I could catch it, one of the bags tipped and burst open. James's clothes spilled out across the floor. A pair of jeans, a sweatshirt, and the leather-bound journal I gave him on our 5th anniversary. My knees hit the ground faster than my thoughts. I began scooping things up with shaking hands. A pair of running shoes? The tie he wore to our anniversary dinner? I pressed my hand against his folded flannel shirt and felt the weight of everything we'd built together. Gone. "Let me help you, ma'am." I looked up into the eyes of a woman in a navy vest with a name tag. Gloria. She had lines around her eyes that deepened with her gentle smile. She didn't rush me. She didn't ask questions. She just helped, her movements quiet, respectful. When the suitcase was repacked and latched, she asked softly, "Is someone coming for you?" I shook my head. "My family is busy," I managed. Her expression didn't shift into pity, just something quieter. Understanding. "I'll walk you to the rideshare line," she offered. "No one should have to do this part alone." The ride cost $78, 0 cents, surge pricing. The driver, a kind-eyed older man named Paul, talked about the weather, the city traffic, and how he once got lost in his own neighborhood because the streets all looked the same. I gave vague answers and smiled when it seemed right. When he pulled up to my house, he asked, "Are you sure you're all right, miss? You seem like you might need someone." "I'm okay," I lied. He helped carry the bags to the porch. As his taillights faded down the street, I turned to the front door, fumbling for the key in my coat pocket. The porch light was off. No warmth from the windows, just darkness and silence. I'd asked my mother to turn on the heat before I arrived. She must have forgotten. Inside, the air was still and stale, a faint scent of dust and dry wood. The mail basket overflowed with envelopes, grocery flyers, medical bills, one card from an insurance company. The fridge hummed in the background, its contents revealed to be a jar of mustard, a shriveled apple, and something unidentifiable sealed in plastic. My brother had promised to stock the basics. He hadn't. I left the bags at the door and walked upstairs to our bedroom. I didn't turn on the light. Moonlight from the hallway window was enough. The bed was too big, too made. I couldn't bring myself to lie in it. Instead, I curled up in the armchair by the window, still wearing my coat, watching as snow began to fall in slow, silent flakes. The house was cold, not just in temperature but in memory. My phone buzzed again. "Troy, seriously, sis, we can't rearrange our schedules at the last minute. This is why planning exists, Mom. Your father and I have dinner with the Hendersons tonight. We RSVP'd weeks ago. Dad, forecast says rain, drive safe." Not one asked if I'd arrived. Not one asked how I was holding up after burying James across the world. I typed back, "No worries, I understand." I didn't understand. I never had. I reached into my bag and pulled out James's coffee mug, chipped on the rim, stained from daily use. I held it like a memory I didn't want to let go of. My fingers trembled, my chest ached with the familiar, hollow pressure. I had come home, but there was no welcome. This would be the last time, I whispered to myself. The last time I expected water from an empty well. The house didn't answer. Only the quiet creak of old wood beneath cold air, and deeper silences. The house looked exactly as I left it, and yet it felt like no one expected me to return. The thermostat was never turned on. The heat I begged for? Forgotten, like me. The cold had a presence, thick, biting, settling into every crevice of the house like it had been waiting for me. I pressed my palm against the thermostat. It was dark, unresponsive, the same way the rest of the house had greeted me. I tapped the screen again. Nothing. I whispered a breath into the air and watched it fog in front of me like smoke. It was early morning, but the light outside barely touched the windows. A storm was rolling in, the kind the local news had been warning about all week. I should have expected this. But some part of me, foolish, still hoping, had trusted that they'd done the one thing I asked. Turn on the heat. Just that. The floor was cold beneath my socks. I walked slowly into the kitchen, each step echoing louder than it should have. I had slept in my coat the night before, curled in the armchair like a child at a sleepover where she wasn't truly welcome. The ache in my neck reminded me I was no child. Just a widow in an empty house that used to hold dreams. My phone buzzed. A news notification about ice on the roads. No message from my family, no apology, no follow-up. They must have known the temperature had dropped. Everyone had, but knowing and caring were not the same. The fridge held little hope. A packet of crackers, stale. A bottle of orange juice was long expired. I chewed one cracker slowly, more out of ritual than hunger. The power flickered once. I stood very still, waiting for it to hold. Then I heard it. Drip. It was soft at first, almost polite. Then another, then another. I followed the sound down the hallway to the dining room. A slow trail of droplets from the ceiling formed a widening puddle on the hardwood floor. My breath caught. Above, a faint crack traced across the ceiling like a fault line. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I grabbed a chair and climbed up, my fingers brushing the damp ceiling. Cold water seeped through the plaster, the upstairs pipes. I turned on my heel and ran to the utility closet, heart pounding, fumbling for the main water shutoff valve. The metal wheel burned my fingers with cold, and it took everything I had to twist it fully shut. But the damage had begun. Water was already spreading beneath the floorboards, warping the wood with quiet cruelty. I stood there, soaked to the knees, staring down at the growing mess. The silence of the house deepened. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and called my brother. He answered on the fourth ring. "Hey, I can't really talk right now. I mentioned getting ready for that dinner with the Wilsons. There's water everywhere," I said flatly. A pipe burst. The heat was never turned on. "That sucks," he replied. No pause, no urgency. "Did you try other plumbers? Angie's List?" "Brandon," I said slowly. "I just got back from burying my husband. I've been traveling for more than a day straight. I'm exhausted. I can't stay here. There's water in the light fixtures, no heat. I could get seriously hurt. Tonight's really bad timing. Lisa and I have clients over. Our guest room's full of her craft stuff anyway. Have you tried Mom and Dad?" I didn't answer. I hung up and dialed my parents next. My mother answered with a kind of brightness that felt like an insult. "Oh, honey, you know we would normally say yes, but the bridge club is meeting here tomorrow, and your father's back has been acting up." "I can't stay in the house," I repeated, slower this time. "It's freezing. There's a flood. Well, what about a hotel? You should have insurance for that sort of thing, right?" The click of a teacup against porcelain came through the line. She was pouring herself something warm while I stood in cold water, soaked to the skin. I hung up. I didn't even try to dry off. I went upstairs to change, but couldn't bring myself to touch any of James's folded clothes. Instead, I put on one of the spare sweatshirts I'd left behind months ago, something soft and oversized. My hair was wet. My hands are numb. I moved slowly through the motions. It wasn't just the house that had flooded. It was my trust, a slow rising tide that had finally breached the walls I'd built to excuse them. In the basement, I heard another drip. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The stairs creaked. The air smelled of mildew and metal. Water met my ankles halfway down. I gripped the railing, heart racing. If I could just reach the panel, maybe I could reset something. Get a little warmth, maybe. I stepped carefully, breath short and shallow. The water rippled around my legs. I moved toward the far wall where the electrical box was mounted. My flashlight flickered, then died. I cursed under my breath and used my phone's light instead. I reached for the panel door, and then my foot slipped. I fell forward. Instinct made me throw out my hand to break the fall, and it landed directly on the cold metal. A violent jolt shot through me. I didn't scream. There wasn't time. My body snapped back, hitting the wet concrete. My head cracked against something hard, and I remember the sound. I remember nothing after that. Somewhere above me, the smoke detector began to beep. I couldn't tell if it was from the water or something worse. If Diane hadn't seen the water pooling on the porch, I would have died within the hour. I woke to a different ceiling, pale and square with recessed lights that hummed softly. The smell of antiseptic, the steady hiss of an oxygen line, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. It took a moment before I realized I was alive. My right arm tingled as if full of pins. My temple throbbed where something rough had been stitched. The last thing I remembered was water, the dark, and the high-pitched alarm. A voice broke through the fog. "You're safe now." I turned my head, and a young nurse with warm brown eyes and a sunflower pin on her scrub smiled at me. "I'm Jessica. You're at Portland General Hospital." Her voice was low and steady, as if she'd done this before, walked people back from the edge. She checked the IV line and adjusted my blanket, tucking it tighter around my shoulders. "Your neighbor called 911, she said. "You were hypothermic and suffering carbon monoxide exposure. The firefighters found you unconscious on your sofa." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. She offered a cup of ice water. The coolness grounded me. "Diane," I rasped. "She saw the porch?" Jessica nodded. "She saved your life." My eyes closed. The image of water running under my front door flickered behind my lids. Diane Miller, across the street neighbor, someone I'd only waved to in passing. She'd noticed what my own family hadn't. Later, when I could sit up, Jessica brought a tablet with my medical chart. "There's something else," she said gently. "A reporter was here covering storm injuries. He overheard the paramedics talking about your case. He's already spoken with your neighbor." I stared at her. "My case?" "They're calling it a human interest story," she explained. "A woman who just buried her husband overseas, comes home to a disaster, nearly dies alone. And the texts from your family were still open on your phone when they found you." I felt my stomach twist. Private messages, the kind that were supposed to stay hidden, are now fuel for public consumption. I wanted to be angry, but I was too tired. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, I didn't care anymore. The world could see what I had endured. Maybe it was time. That evening, a man with a press badge appeared at the end of my bed. "Michael Chen," he introduced himself softly. "I'm the one writing the piece. I wanted to ask permission to include your story." I hesitated. Jessica, standing behind him, gave me a subtle nod, like she knew I needed the choice to be mine. "I don't want to be a spectacle," I murmured. "You wouldn't be," Michael said. "Your neighbor and the paramedics already spoke. People are moved. Local businesses are offering help. This could bring support while you recover." Support? From strangers? My family had offered nothing but excuses and polite indifference. A tremor passed through me. "Do it," I whispered. If it helps someone else, do it. After he left, Jessica sat beside me. What about your family? Do you want me to call them? I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. They'll come. Not for me. For their image. My hand curled around the blanket. I have to stop pretending that's enough. Her gaze was steady. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go after discharge. We have resources. The door opened before I could answer. My brother entered first, his face pale, his tie askew as though he'd thrown himself together in a hurry. Evelyn, he said, almost breathless. We just saw the news. They're making it sound like we abandoned you. Behind him, my mother swept in, coat still buttoned, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is a complete misrepresentation, she told Jessica before even looking at me. We had no idea the house was in such condition. Of course, we would have helped if we'd understood the situation. My father lingered at the doorway, silent as always, eyes unreadable. I pressed my palm against the blanket, grounding myself. You didn't ask, I said softly. My voice trembled, but didn't break. Not once did any of you ask how I was really doing. Brandon looked offended. That's not fair, I cut him off. When James was dying, you were too busy to come. When I buried him alone, you said flights were too expensive. When I needed a ride from the airport after 30 hours of travel, you suggested Uber. When I called about the burst pipe, you had bridge club and business dinners. My mother's cheeks flushed. Families can't drop everything for every crisis. Your expectations... Needing a ride from the airport after burying my husband is an unrealistic expectation. My voice rose, then steadied. Hoping someone might have checked the heat was working in my house during winter was asking too much. Jessica quietly adjusted my IV, her presence like an anchor. My father shifted at the door, but said nothing. I am not a rescue machine, I said at last, each word measured. I also get tired, and I'm tired of making excuses for you. Silence pressed in. For a moment, even the heart monitor seemed to pause. Jessica leaned closer. You don't have to go with them, she murmured. There are alternatives. I looked at my family. Their eyes darted from me to each other, calculating. Damage control, not remorse. Something inside me hardened. Not rage, but clarity. I choose kindness over obligation, I said, and I will not accept help that comes with a guilt invoice. Their mouths opened, but no words came. For the first time, the performance faltered. This is not revenge, I whispered to the nurse. This is survival. I returned to my house with two things, a bag of clothes and a folder full of strangers' kindness. The driver waited patiently while I unlocked the door. The house looked drier, emptier, but still unfamiliar, as if it had aged during my absence. Plastic tarps covered parts of the floor, fans hummed in the corners. I stepped inside, gripping the folder that held emergency contact numbers, meal service info, and a hotel voucher, handed to me with quiet assurance by the hospital social worker. On the other hand, I carried a small overnight bag with clean clothes and the wrapped leftovers of banana bread a nurse had insisted I take. It was strange how you could walk back into the same four walls and feel like a guest. The couch still faced the fireplace, but the cushions looked wrong. I glanced toward the dining table. One chair was missing, the one James always used. I hadn't noticed before. I walked slowly, every step cautious, like the house might betray me again. The air still carried a faint dampness, mixed with the chemical tang of cleaning supplies. The restoration team had done its part. But there were things they couldn't fix. Diane knocked on the open door an hour later. She stood with a paper bag of groceries and a container of soup in her hands. Thought you could use some real food, she said, and maybe just someone nearby. I let her in, surprised by how much I wanted her to stay. We sat at the kitchen table, the one chair she brought in from the porch creaking beneath her. I poured us tea from the electric kettle someone had plugged in while I was gone. A quiet kindness. I stirred honey into mine out of habit, though it tasted like nothing. You okay being here? Diane asked gently. No, I said, but I need to be. The soup warmed my hands more than my stomach. We didn't talk much. She told me the neighborhood missed James, that his jokes about her flower beds had become a little tradition she now carried on herself. After she left, I wandered upstairs to the room we once called ours. The floor had been mopped clean, the walls untouched. His side of the closet still held the same clothes: a cardigan, the flannel shirt, shoes lined neatly below exactly how he'd left them. But they looked more like exhibits than belongings now. I opened a drawer and found the book he'd been reading. Inside it, folded carefully between 2 pages, was a note in his handwriting. It read, "Save this one for the rainy days. Love you always. N." I sat on the floor with the book against my chest, trying not to dissolve. Grief didn't explode anymore. It pressed, quiet and unbearable. Later that night, I pulled out the folder. A local contractor had offered to upgrade the plumbing for free. A hotel downtown had offered me a suite for 2 weeks. Volunteers had signed up to help with errands, and none of them were related to me. None of them owed me anything. The next morning, I visited the garden. It was still half frozen, soil too stiff to dig, but I brushed away leaves from the raised bed. Last spring, James and I had planted a row of crocuses near the edge. He'd called them tiny warriors for how they bloomed through frost. One small green shoot had already pushed through, resilient, unbothered by the cold. The sun broke through gray clouds, painting the house in pale gold. It was the first time I saw it not just as a ruin or a shell, but as a space that might be reclaimed, not for the memories, but for myself. I walked back inside and unpacked. I placed James's mug on the shelf again. His sweater was folded at the end of the bed. The carved box from Bali is beside the window where he used to sit and drink coffee. When I looked up, Diane was outside again, talking to 2 men in work boots. Robert and Thomas, neighbors I barely knew. They waved. I waved back. As the wind picked up, a branch scraped softly against the house. I turned toward the bedroom one last time, gazing at the chair I hadn't touched since the day I left. James's chair. Still empty. But now, I understood. It always would be. That space didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the silence he left behind and the strength I'd need to fill it. I reached into the drawer and placed his note in a frame. "This isn't a shrine," I whispered. "It's a beginning. I knew then, if I stayed in this house too long, I'd become a ghost like him." A handwritten letter from my father arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. I stared at it for hours before opening it. It had snowed again overnight. Just a thin layer, enough to soften the corners of the yard and hush the street. I sipped coffee in the kitchen, holding the mug with both hands for warmth. Outside, the crocus I'd uncovered yesterday still stood, a fragile burst of green against the white. It looked braver than I felt. The letter had been waiting on the front mat when I opened the door that morning. No postmark, no return address, just my name in slanted handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Not printed on birthday cards, not inside holiday envelopes, not even in his own texts. My father didn't write letters. He delegated those things to my mother, to Hallmark, to Time. But this envelope was unmistakably his. I carried it around the house all morning, set it down next to the sink while washing dishes, left it on the arm of the couch while folding laundry, balanced it on the stack of books I'd brought from the hospital. It was heavy in the way things are when they carry more than words. By the afternoon, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I sat at the dining table, the kitchen clock ticking steadily behind me, and opened the letter. His handwriting was uneven, like he hadn't written much by hand in a long time. There were small corrections, crossed out words, rewritten phrases, but what struck me most was the space between the lines, as if he needed room to breathe between each confession. He wrote of regret but not apology, of how he had watched the news and felt something rupture inside, how he didn't expect forgiveness, only acknowledgement. "I failed you," he said, "not because I didn't care, but because I didn't understand what care should have looked like." I read it twice, then folded it and placed it inside the drawer by the entryway. I wasn't ready to answer, but I didn't throw it away either. Later that week, I sat in a circle of folding chairs at the community center, surrounded by others who carried invisible weights. Eleanor, the grief group facilitator, had a quiet way of guiding people, not by force, but by presence. She offered no platitudes, only space, When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. My voice felt like a fragile thread. I buried my husband in a country where I didn't know the language, I began, but that wasn't the loneliest part. The loneliest part was coming home. Heads nodded, no one interrupted. My family didn't show up, not at the hospital, not when I called. They told me to take an Uber. Eleanor looked at me gently. What do you need from them now? I don't know, I said honestly. I think maybe I just need not to need them anymore. Back home, I began cleaning out the last untouched closet. It had become a sort of time capsule, boxes we never unpacked, clothes we meant to donate, a pile of Christmas decorations still tangled in string lights. In the bottom drawer of James's dresser, beneath an old wool sweater, I found a small wrapped box. My name was scribbled on the label. I sat cross-legged on the floor and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a silver bracelet with a tiny seashell charm. One of the ones we'd collected on a beach trip 2 years ago. Tucked underneath was a note. You always look for meaning in small things, he wrote. Maybe this will remind you that little things matter, even on hard days. I cried then, not from grief, but from the kindness of being remembered in advance. That evening, I emailed the university where James and I had met. I'd been thinking about it for weeks. Something he'd always wanted. A scholarship to help students study abroad, especially those who didn't have safety nets. I proposed the James Hart Memorial Scholarship for International Education, with a small emergency travel fund built in. The next morning, I received a call from a student named Angela, a junior who'd applied for the first round of scholarship funding. She was planning to study in Japan and had lost both her parents in high school. Her voice trembled as she thanked me over and over. I didn't think anyone would understand, she said, but your story, it gave me hope. I stood in the kitchen, holding the phone with one hand and James's seashell bracelet in the other. Eleanor had said something in a group that stuck with me. We don't always heal by confronting what hurt us. Sometimes we heal by building what we never had. I wasn't sure if I believed that yet, but I was trying. I wasn't ready to forgive them, but I was ready to live without them. 1 year later, I stood at the same airport I'd returned to in tears, but this time I was leaving in peace. The glass walls of Portland International shimmered under soft spring light. Travelers bustled past with rolling luggage, checked their phones, and stood in lines for coffee. The scent of jet fuel and fresh-baked pretzels mingled in the air. I stood quietly near gate B-22. Watching the plane I would soon board ease toward the terminal. It had been exactly a year. Last time I walked through these gates, I was broken. Exhausted, holding pieces of my husband's life in overstuffed suitcases, begging for someone to notice I was drowning. No one had. Today I carried a lighter bag, no suitcase bursting at the seams, no grief clawing at my throat, just a small duffel, a passport, and a letter to leave at James's grave. Singapore had never been on my list of places to return to, but something inside me said I had to go, not to relive the pain, but to close the loop. Not to find James, but to speak to him one last time. The airline attendant called boarding group 1. I waited. I wasn't in a rush anymore. 2 days earlier, I had hosted a small gathering at my home. The living room had been cleaned, painted, filled with the smell of fresh flowers and cinnamon from Diane's apple crumble. The room was full, not with family, but with chosen people. Jessica came, her sunflower pin still tucked in her hair. Eleanor brought lemon cookies. Robert and Thomas stood awkwardly by the window, unsure what to do with their hands, but smiling widely when I hugged them. And Angela was there. Bright-eyed and a little nervous, she wore a navy blazer too big for her, sleeves rolled at the cuffs. I handed her the first official certificate of the James Hart Memorial Scholarship. Her voice cracked when she thanked me. You turned your story into something solid, something I can carry. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees lining my backyard, I stepped out onto the porch with a glass of water. The wind chime James had hung the summer before he left stirred gently in the breeze. I touched it once, letting the soft ringing fade into the quiet. This morning, before heading to the airport, I stopped by the garden. The crocuses had returned, more of them now. I picked one, pressed it gently between 2 pages of James's old journal, and packed it with the letter. Now, at the gate, they called my group. I boarded the plane with no tears this time. Just stillness. Just clarity. When I arrived in Singapore, the heat wrapped around me like a memory. I made my way to the cemetery as dawn stretched across the city skyline. It looked just the same. The same narrow path between gravestones. The same shaded tree where I had once sat, clutching James's hand as if I could hold him in the world. I laid the flower and the letter beside his stone. "I finally did what you always told me to," I whispered. I stopped waiting for them to see me. I saw myself instead. I stayed there a long while, letting the breeze carry what needed to be carried. There were no tears, just something quieter, something like peace. The next week moved gently. I walked the same boardwalk we'd once strolled together, ate at our favorite noodle stall, and visited the bookstore where James had spent hours browsing English titles. I'd bought a slim volume of poems and tucked it into my bag. Something new to bring home. When I landed back in Portland, the city had warmed. Trees bloomed. My porch light glowed softly as I walked up the front steps. Inside, the house smelled of basil and lemon. Someone, Diane probably, had left a casserole in the fridge. Later that night, I opened my laptop and found a message waiting. It was from my father. Short, measured, respectful. "Whenever you're ready, no pressure." I closed the message and smiled, not because I planned to reply, but because it no longer hurt not to. That weekend, I sat on the porch with the bracelet James had given me looped around my wrist. Angela had emailed again. Her study abroad program had started. She was in Tokyo, overwhelmed but happy. Her words were full of gratitude and wonder. Her message ended with, "Thank you for choosing to make something out of what was taken." I whispered James's name like a promise. This time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward something I'd built on my own terms. Some stories aren't about revenge or even forgiveness. They're about recognition of who we are, what we've survived, and what we choose to carry forward. Evelyn's story wasn't one of dramatic confrontations or grand reconciliations. It was a quiet, painful, and powerful unraveling of illusion. She had believed for most of her life that love was something you earned, by being useful, by not needing too much, by never asking more than people were willing to give. And so when her world collapsed, when grief flooded every room of her life, it wasn't just her husband she lost. She lost the last threads of the story she told herself about her family, the kind of daughter she thought she was, the kind of sister she tried to be. In her time of greatest need, those closest to her stepped back, and strangers, ordinary, unremarkable people with no obligation, stepped in. A woman at the airport, a rideshare driver, a neighbor across the street, a nurse who asked the right question at the right time. They didn't rescue her out of duty. They helped because they saw her pain, and they chose to care. Evelyn didn't demand apologies. She didn't force understanding. Instead, she chose something more radical, boundaries. She chose to say, "You don't get to hurt me anymore, even if you're family." And that choice, while painful, was the beginning of her healing. Family is supposed to be a place where you are safe, where your return is awaited with warmth. But sometimes, family becomes the coldest place of all, because we spend years trying to be accepted by people incapable of true connection. And that wound is deeper than most, because it whispers, "Maybe I'm the problem." Evelyn's strength was not in her silence, but in her eventual refusal to be silent any longer, in her decision to stop making excuses for neglect, to stop explaining away absence as just the way they are, to stop waiting for someone else's approval to matter. She reclaimed her life not by rebuilding what was broken, but by building something entirely new. She turned her pain into purpose. She didn't pass her suffering forward. She transformed it into a legacy of support, hope, and dignity for others like her who found themselves abandoned when they needed love most. In the end, Evelyn didn't go back to who she was before the grief. She became someone else, someone stronger, someone freer. Her story teaches us that you don't have to stay in places where you're only loved when it's convenient, that loyalty without reciprocity is not noble, it's self-destruction, and that healing isn't just about moving on. It's about finally seeing clearly who never deserved to stay. You are not difficult to need. You are not ungrateful for saying no, and you are not selfish for expecting compassion. Sometimes, the people we expect the most from have the least to give. That doesn't make you unworthy. It makes you brave enough to still choose to love yourself in the absence of their love. Evelyn's peace didn't come from fixing her family. It came from redefining what family meant, and maybe that's the real justice. Have you ever experienced something like this, where distance brought you closer to peace than family ever did? Share your story in the comments. If you found Evelyn's journey meaningful, leave the number 1 in the comments and subscribe to the channel Family Fallout Stories to hear the next story of truth, survival, and quiet strength. Because sometimes, healing begins the moment you stop asking for permission to matter